The first time Nina Alvarez asked for help, no one even looked up. The nurse's station was busy, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, charts sliding across the counter. Nina stood just outside the taped line on the floor, hands clenched around the strap of her worn shoulder bag, eyes fixed on the woman in blue scrubs typing without pause. "Excuse me," Nina said softly. "My brother's pain medication was due an hour ago." The nurse nodded once without meeting her eyes. "Someone will get to it." No name, no timeline, no reassurance. Nina stepped back, heart tightening. Her brother Mateo lay in room 617, a thin blanket pulled up to his chest, his breathing shallow and uneven. He was only 34. A construction accident, they'd said. Complications, they'd added later. Words stacked on top of each other until they stopped sounding like explanations and started sounding like excuses. Nina had been at the hospital every day since he was admitted. She learned quickly how invisible you could become in a place built to save lives. Doctors swept in and out of the room speaking in clipped phrases she had to translate in her head. When she asked questions, they answered the wall behind her. When she asked again, they reminded her, politely, that she wasn't the patient. "You're his sister," one resident said once, smiling tightly. "We're doing everything we can." Nina nodded then, the way women like her were taught to nod. She was Latina, early 40s, dressed plainly. No white coat, no credentials anyone recognized. Just family, just concern, just another voice the hospital had learned how to tune out. On the third night, Mateo cried out in pain. Nina pressed the call button. Nothing. She pressed it again and again. 20 minutes passed before a nurse arrived, irritation already visible on her face. "We're short-staffed," the nurse said. "You'll have to be patient." Nina felt something harden in her chest. "He's trying," she said quietly, "but he's hurting." The nurse sighed. "We'll see what we can do." She left. Nina sat back down, holding her brother's hand, feeling how cold it was. She whispered to him, telling him stories from home, from when they were kids, from before life had taught her how easily people were overlooked when they didn't belong to the right category. From the hallway she overheard two doctors talking. "Room 617, one said. "Family's been hovering non-stop." "Yeah," the other replied. "They always do." They laughed softly and walked away. Nina stared at the closed door, her reflection faint in the glass. They saw her as a problem, a complication, a distraction. They had no idea who she was. They had no idea what she was capable of. As dawn crept through the narrow hospital window, Nina made a quiet promise to herself, one that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with resolve. If they wouldn't listen now, she would make sure they had no choice later. Because ignoring her was the first mistake they would regret. By the end of the first week, Nina knew the hospital's rhythm better than some of the staff. She knew when the night shift changed and which nurses rushed through vitals just to clear their boards. She knew which residents avoided eye contact and which ones spoke in rehearsed sympathy. She knew that if she asked questions in the morning, she was anxious, and if she asked them at night, she was difficult. She adjusted anyway. She kept notes in a small spiral notebook, times, names, dosages, missed rounds. Not because she wanted to accuse anyone, but because she had learned that memory didn't count unless it was written down. Pain didn't count unless it showed up on a chart. When she mentioned the notebook to a nurse once, the woman smiled thinly. "You don't need to do that," she said. "We have it under control." But they didn't. Mateo's condition worsened in small, frightening ways. A fever that came and went. Confusion that doctors dismissed as normal recovery. Delays explained away as scheduling issues. Nina watched her brother's body struggle while the system moved at its own pace, efficient in theory and careless in practice. One afternoon, a senior physician entered the room with a cluster of residents trailing behind him like shadows. He spoke quickly, flipping through Mateo's chart without pausing. "We're monitoring," he said. "Let's give it time." Nina stepped forward. "With respect," she said, "he hasn't improved in 3 days. He's in more pain. Something's wrong." The doctor glanced at her, just briefly. "We'll update you," he said, already turning away. Nina felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but this time she didn't sit back down. "I need someone to listen," she said, louder now. The doctor stopped. The residents froze. "We are listening," he replied, his voice measured. "But you need to understand that medical decisions aren't made based on family anxiety." Anxiety? Nina swallowed. She nodded. She stepped aside. But inside, something clicked into place. That night, alone in the cafeteria with a cup of untouched coffee, Nina opened her laptop. She pulled up old files she hadn't touched in years. Reports, budgets, projections. Before she had put her career on pause to help raise Matteo after their parents died, Nina had worked in healthcare finance. Not medicine, not patient care, but systems. She understood how hospitals actually functioned, how funding shaped priorities, how outcomes followed resources, how listening often began only when money spoke first. She didn't act out of spite, she acted out of clarity. Over the next few days, Nina made calls, quiet ones. She contacted an old colleague now working in hospital administration at another institution. She asked careful questions, not about Matteo, but about process, about escalation paths, about review boards, about what triggered attention. The answers were consistent. Documentation mattered, patterns mattered, and influence mattered most of all. When Nina returned to the nurses' station on the 10th day and asked to speak with the patient advocate, the staff looked surprised. The advocate arrived an hour later, polite but distant. Nina handed over her notebook without a word. Times, names, missed responses, delays. The woman flipped through the pages slowly. Her expression changed, not to guilt, but to concern. "I'll look into this," she said. For the first time since Matteo's admission, someone followed up the same day. Tests were reordered. A specialist was consulted. Medication was adjusted. The change was sudden enough to feel jarring. Matteo slept more easily that night. Nina sat beside him, exhausted but alert. She knew better than to believe the fight was over. They were listening now, but not because they had finally seen her. They were listening because the system had recognized a risk. And Nina understood something clearly as she watched her brother breathe more steadily. If this was what it took to be heard, then one day, when the crisis was no longer personal, she would make sure fewer families ever had to fight this hard just to matter. The hospital had ignored a patient's sister. They were about to learn what happens when the person you ignore understands how to change the rules. The turning point came quietly, the way most real changes do. Matteo's conditions stabilized, then improved. Slowly at first, small signs that might have gone unnoticed if Nina hadn't trained herself to watch closely. His fever stayed down, his breathing evened out. When he woke, his eyes were clearer, less clouded by pain and confusion. A different specialist visited his room each morning now, and nurses responded to the call button faster than before. People used Nina's name, not often, not warmly, but deliberately. She recognized the shift for what it was: containment. The hospital wasn't suddenly compassionate, it was cautious. Her notebook, her questions, the involvement of the patient advocate, those had created a paper trail, a quiet signal that this case could become inconvenient if mishandled. Nina didn't celebrate. She kept writing everything down. One afternoon, as she stepped out of Matteo's room to take a call, she overheard a conversation near the elevators. 617 is the sister, a nurse said. Yeah, another replied. Administration flagged it. Figures. There was no malice in their voices, just resignation. Nina leaned against the wall after they walked away, phone still pressed to her ear, pulse steady. She wasn't offended. In a strange way, she was relieved. Being flagged meant being seen, And being seen, even for the wrong reasons, was safer than being ignored. A week later, Matteo was moved to a step-down unit. The room was brighter, the hallway quieter. Recovery was no longer theoretical, it was happening. When the attending physician came in that morning, he actually sat down. "I want to acknowledge your persistence," he said carefully. "You were right to push." Nina nodded. "I wasn't pushing," she replied. "I was paying attention." The doctor smiled faintly, unsure how to respond. That afternoon, Nina received an email from the hospital's patient relations department. It was formal, full of polite language and institutional concern. They wanted feedback, a meeting, a chance to understand her experience. She read it twice. This was the part she knew well. Organizations rarely asked questions unless they were already worried about the answers. Nina agreed to the meeting, scheduled for the following week. She didn't prepare an emotional speech, she prepared data. She reviewed hospital performance metrics, public funding reports, patient satisfaction scores, and charitable donation structures. The same skills she had once used to optimize budgets and forecast risk now applied themselves naturally to a different problem. When the meeting day came, Nina sat across from 3 administrators in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the city. They thanked her for her time, they expressed regret. They assured her the hospital was committed to equity and excellence. Nina listened, then she opened her notebook. She didn't accuse, she described. She laid out timelines, patterns, and gaps. She connected her brother's experience to broader systemic issues, staffing ratios, communication breakdowns, escalation failures. She spoke calmly, precisely, without anger. By the time she finished, the room was quiet. One administrator cleared his throat. "May I ask," he said, "what you do for a living?" Nina met his eyes. "I analyze healthcare systems," she said. "I used to help fund them." The truth landed heavily. They asked more questions then, real ones, about recommendations, about priorities, about what meaningful change might look like beyond apologies and policy statements. Nina answered honestly. She didn't promise anything, she didn't threaten anything. But as she left the meeting, she knew something fundamental had shifted. Matteo would recover. That part was becoming clear. What wasn't clear, at least not yet, was that this hospital's future would soon be shaped by the very person it had once dismissed as just another worried sister. And when that day came, the lessons learned in room 617 would no longer be optional. The wing was announced 2 years later, not with Nina's name in bold letters, not with a dramatic ceremony meant to rewrite history, but quietly, in the hospital's annual report, buried between capital improvements and donor acknowledgements. A new patient-centered care wing, expanded staffing, integrated family advocate systems, a redesigned escalation protocol modelled on recent internal reviews. Only a few people in the building remembered room 617. Nina did. By then, Matteo was healthy, working again, laughing easily in ways that still surprised her. Life had returned to something like normal, but Nina had not gone back to who she was before the hospital. She hadn't planned to. After that first meeting, the hospital kept calling. Not urgently, not publicly, but persistently. They asked her to review proposals, to comment on workflow changes, to sit in on a committee as an external voice. At first, she declined most of it. Grief had a long tail, and she needed distance. But distance doesn't erase clarity. Nina saw the same patterns everywhere she looked. Well-meaning institutions built on outdated assumptions. Systems optimized for efficiency over humanity. Families treated as obstacles instead of partners, unless they had leverage. She decided to become that leverage. Through a private foundation, she quietly reactivated, one she and Matteo had inherited and barely touched. Nina began funding targeted healthcare projects, not flashy donations, strategic ones, grants tied to outcomes, money that required listening. Hospitals responded quickly when the questions came with resources. When she approached her brother's hospital again, it wasn't as a complainant, it was as a potential partner. The meeting this time was different. Executives were present, so were development officers. They asked what kind of wing she wanted to name, what recognition she expected, what legacy she hoped to build. Nina surprised them. "I don't want my name on it," she said. "I want the system changed." She laid out her conditions calmly. Dedicated patient-family advocates with authority, mandatory response time tracking, clear escalation paths that didn't depend on knowing the right words or the right people. Training that treated family insight as data, not interference. "And I want this model published," she added, "so it can be replicated." There was a pause. Then the hospital agreed. The funding covered the entire wing: construction, staffing, training, evaluation. It became the pilot project administrators pointed to when outcomes improved and complaints dropped. Other hospitals called to ask how it worked. Some copied it, some resisted. Nina didn't mind either way. Change, she knew, didn't need applause. It needed momentum. On opening day, Nina walked the new wing alone. Sunlight poured through wide windows. The nurses' station was open, accessible. A sign near the entrance read, "Families are part of the care team." She stopped there for a long moment. A nurse passed by and smiled at her. "Are you visiting someone?" Nina smiled back. "Not today." As she turned to leave, she passed a young woman standing near the desk, nervous, holding a worn shoulder bag, waiting to speak. Nina slowed, just for a second. "You can ask," she said gently. "They'll listen." The woman looked relieved and stepped forward. Nina walked out into the daylight, the city moving around her as it always had. The hospital had once ignored a patient's sister. Now, every decision made in that wing carried the quiet imprint of a woman who had refused to stay invisible and chose instead to make listening unavoidable.